Sometimes the hardest working people get the smallest rewards, and sometimes a stranger's kindness can change everything. We've all wondered what we'd do if opportunity knocked on our door when we needed it most. Eliza Mae Henderson has been fighting to keep her family's ranch alive, working from dawn to dusk just to survive. On a stormy night in 1887, a dying gunslinger named Samuel Silvershot Carter collapses at her door. With his final breath, he whispers about a hidden fortune and hands her a blood-stained map. Now bounty hunters, outlaws, and land barons are coming for what Samuel left behind. But why did he choose her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind carried the scent of snow across the Montana Territory, whistling through the gaps in Eliza Mae Henderson's cabin walls like a lonesome song. She pulled her father's old wool coat tighter around her shoulders and stepped onto the sagging porch, her boots creaking against the weathered boards. The Henderson ranch stretched out before her in the pale morning light, 300 acres of stubborn grass and rocky soil that had been in her family for 20 years. 20 years of back-breaking work. And what did she have to show for it? A dozen head of cattle where there used to be 50, a barn that leaked worse than a politician's promises, and a mortgage payment that came due every month like clockwork. At 28, Eliza had already lived through more hardship than most folks saw in a lifetime. Her mother had died birthing her, and her father had raised her alone until consumption took him 3 winters past. The blood-stained map lay folded on her kitchen table, beside the cold cup of coffee she'd been nursing since dawn. Samuel Silvershot, Carter's final words, still echoed in her mind. The treasure, yours. Trust no one. She'd heard stories about Carter in town, how he'd killed 12 men in fair fights, how he'd robbed banks from Texas to Wyoming, how he'd once shot a man's hat clean off his head from 200 yards just to prove a point. But the man who died in her arms hadn't looked like a fearsome gunslinger. He'd looked like somebody's grandfather, with silver hair and kind eyes that held more sadness than malice. His hands had been soft, not the calloused mitts of a working man, and his clothes had been fine quality despite the blood and mud. When she'd searched his pockets, she'd found more questions than answers. The map itself was a mystery. Drawn on what looked like expensive paper, it showed landmarks she didn't recognize: a twisted tree, a rock formation shaped like a woman's profile, a creek that supposedly ran through Devil's Canyon. The handwriting was educated, precise, nothing like what she'd expect from an outlaw. Strange symbols marked certain locations, and at the bottom, in different ink, someone had written, "For the daughter of Thomas Henderson, debt is paid." Her father's name, Thomas Henderson, had been a quiet man, a former cavalry officer who'd come west after the war to start fresh. He'd never spoken much about his past, but Eliza had always sensed there were stories he kept buried. Now, staring at this map, she wondered what debts her father might have carried, what connections he might have had to the world of gunslingers and outlaws. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled her from her thoughts. 3 riders emerged from the morning mist, their horses moving at a steady pace toward her cabin. Eliza's hand instinctively moved to the rifle mounted beside the door. Living alone on the frontier, a woman learned to be careful about unexpected visitors. The lead rider was a big man with a black beard and expensive clothes too, expensive for honest work. His companions looked like hired muscle, the kind of men who solved problems with their fists rather than their wits. They reined in their horses at the edge of her yard, close enough to talk but far enough to make a quick escape if needed. "Morning, Miss Henderson," the bearded man called out, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed more mockery than courtesy. "Name's Marcus Blackwood. I own the Double B spread down in the valley." Eliza knew the name. Blackwood had been buying up ranches all across the territory, usually from families who'd fallen on hard times. His methods weren't always entirely legal, but he had the sheriff in his pocket and enough money to make problems disappear. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, keeping her voice steady, "what brings you to my land?" "Well, that's a fine question," Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you had some excitement here last night. Thought I'd ride out and make sure you were all right." News traveled fast in a small territory, but not that fast. Someone had told Blackwood about Samuel's death, which meant he'd been watching her place. The thought made her skin crawl. "I'm fine, thank you for asking. Just a man who took sick and needed help." "Sick, was he?" Blackwood's voice carried a note of amusement. "That's not what I heard. I heard Samuel Carter died on your doorstep last night. Shame about old Samuel, he was a colorful character." The way he said it made Eliza's blood run cold. Blackwood wasn't just fishing for information. He knew exactly what had happened. More importantly, he knew who Samuel was and why his death mattered. "If you already knew, why ask?" she said, surprised by her own boldness. Blackwood's smile widened. "Because I'm curious about what else might have happened. Samuel was known to carry interesting items with him, maps, for instance, or documents that might prove valuable to the right person." There it was, the real reason for his visit. Somehow, Blackwood knew about the map. Eliza forced herself to remain calm, though her heart was racing. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Now, Miss Henderson, let's not play games. Samuel Carter didn't choose your doorstep by accident. He was a careful man who did everything for a reason. If he died here, he left something behind, something that rightfully belongs to more experienced hands." One of Blackwood's men shifted in his saddle, his coat falling open to reveal a gun butt. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. "Mr. Blackwood," Eliza said, gripping the rifle more tightly, "I think you should leave my property." "Property?" Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Miss Henderson, you're 3 months behind on your mortgage. The bank is about to foreclose on this place. You might want to consider being more cooperative with your neighbors." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd been struggling to make the payments, but she hadn't realized how far behind she'd fallen. The bank president was another of Blackwood's allies. If he wanted her gone, he could make it happen. "I'll catch up on the payments," she said, though she had no idea how. "I'm sure you will." Blackwood gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "But if you happen to find anything that belonged to Samuel Carter, you might want to think twice before keeping it. Some treasures are more dangerous than they're worth." As the 3 riders disappeared into the morning mist, Eliza sank into the chair beside her door. Her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. Blackwood's visit had changed everything. What had seemed like a strange stroke of luck now felt like a death sentence. She went back inside and unfolded the map again, studying it with new eyes. Samuel Carter had been more than just a dying gunslinger seeking help. He'd been a man with enemies, a man whose death would bring dangerous attention to anyone who tried to claim his legacy. The treasure he'd promised might be real, but it came with a price that could cost her everything. Yet what choice did she have? The ranch was already lost if she couldn't make the mortgage payments. Her father's legacy would be sold to the highest bidder, probably Blackwood himself. Samuel's map might be her only chance to save what remained of her family's dreams. As she traced the strange symbols with her finger, Eliza made a decision that would change her life forever. She would follow the map, find Samuel's treasure, and discover the truth about her father's connection to the mysterious gunslinger. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they couldn't be worse than the slow death of poverty and defeat. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, but Eliza Mae Henderson no longer felt cold. For the first time in years, she felt the warmth of hope burning in her chest. Samuel Carter had given her more than a map, had given her a chance to fight back against the forces that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but inside the little cabin, a woman was preparing for the greatest adventure of her life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor as Eliza spread Samuel's belongings on her kitchen table. Besides the map, she'd found a leather pouch containing items that made her heart race with questions. A gold pocket watch with an inscription she couldn't quite make out, a small silver locket containing a photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like her own mother, and a folded piece of paper with her father's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the yellowed document. It was a letter, dated 15 years ago, written in her father's careful script. "Samuel, the debt will be paid when the time comes. Keep the proof safe until then. My daughter must never know about Helena's choice, or the price we all paid for it. When I'm gone, use your judgment. She has her mother's strength and my stubbornness. She'll need both for what's coming. Thomas." Helena, her mother's name. Eliza sank into a chair, staring at the letter until the words blurred. Her father had been in contact with Samuel Carter. They'd shared some kind of secret, something connected to her mother's death. The woman in the locket, could it really be her mother? The resemblance was uncanny, but the face in the photograph looked older, sadder than the young woman in the single portrait her father had kept. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see two men in dusty coats standing on her porch. They didn't look like Blackwood's Menthes, were harder, leaner, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much violence. Bounty hunters, most likely drawn by news of Samuel's death. "Miss Henderson," the older man's voice carried a Texas drawl. "Name's Pete Hawkins. This here's my partner, Jim Reeves. We're looking for information about a man who might have passed through here yesterday." Eliza opened the door, but kept her hand on the rifle. "I'm not sure I can help you, gentlemen." "We're tracking Samuel Carter," Hawkins continued. "Man's got a price on his head in 3 states. We heard he might have been seen in these parts. I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name." Hawkins smiled, but it was the kind of smile a wolf might give a sheep. "Now, Miss Henderson, that's interesting, because the sheriff in town says a man fitting Carter's description died right here on your doorstep last night. Funny thing to forget about." The second man, Reeves, stepped closer to the door. "We ain't here to cause trouble, ma'am. Just want to claim what's ours by right. Carter's been running from justice for 15 years. Time he answered for his crimes." "If the man is dead," Eliza said carefully, "then justice has been served, hasn't it?" "Dead men don't collect bounties," Hawkins replied, "but they sometimes leave behind things that can prove their identity, personal effects, letters, maybe even maps to places they've been hiding stolen goods." There it was again. Everyone seemed to know about the map. Eliza's mind raced, trying to understand how word had spread so quickly. Samuel had been careful to approach her cabin unseen, but someone had been watching. Someone had known he was coming. "I buried the man this morning," she said, which was true. "He didn't have anything with him except old clothes and empty pockets." Hawkins and Reeves exchanged glances. "That's mighty charitable of you, Miss Henderson," Hawkins said. "But we might need to take a look around, just to be sure. Official business, you understand." "Do you have a warrant?" "Don't need one for a routine investigation." Reeves's hand moved closer to his gun. "Wouldn't want to make this unpleasant for a lady." Before Eliza could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the air. A single rider emerged from the tree line, moving at a steady pace toward the cabin. As he drew closer, Eliza could see he was young, maybe 30, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. His clothes were plain but well made, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew how to handle trouble. "Morning, folks," the newcomer called out as he reined in his horse. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Hawkins turned to face the stranger, his hand hovering near his gun. "This is private business, mister. You'd best move along." "Jake Morrison," the young man said, dismounting with easy grace. "I'm looking for work, and I heard Miss Henderson might need help with her ranch." He looked directly at Eliza, and she saw something in his eyes, a warning, perhaps, or an offer of assistance. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison," she said, playing along with his act, "but I'm not hiring right now." "That's a shame," Jake replied, "especially with winter coming on. A place like this needs a good hand to help with the cattle and repairs." He glanced at the two bounty hunters. "These gentlemen friends of yours?" "Just passing through," Hawkins said curtly. "We were just leaving." "Good thing," Jake said, his voice friendly but firm. "I'd hate for Miss Henderson to feel uncomfortable on her own property." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hawkins and Reeves were clearly outgunned. Jake Morrison might look like a simple drifter, but he moved like a man who'd seen his share of violence. After a moment, Hawkins nodded to his partner. "We'll be back, Miss Henderson," he said, "when we have more time to talk properly." As the bounty hunters mounted their horses and rode away, Eliza felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She'd been saved from immediate trouble, but she had no idea who Jake Morrison really was or what he wanted. "Thank you," she said, as he tied his horse to the porch rail. "But I have to ask, what are you really doing here?" Jake's smile was genuine this time. "Same thing as everyone else, I suspect. Looking for Samuel Carter's treasure." He held up his hands as she reached for the rifle. "But not for the reasons you might think." "How do you know about the treasure?" "Samuel Carter was my uncle," Jake said quietly. "My mother's brother. I've been tracking him for months, trying to find him before those bounty hunters did. I was too late to save him, but maybe I can help you understand what he left behind." Eliza studied his face, looking for signs of deception. "If he was your uncle, why didn't he go to you? Why come to me?" Jake's expression grew sad. "Because he made a promise to someone he loved, someone who trusted him to keep their daughter safe when the time came." He looked directly at her. "Your father and my uncle were partners once, Miss Henderson. Partners in something that went wrong a long time ago." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Partners in what?" "They were lawmen," Jake said. "Federal marshals working undercover to break up a gang of train robbers. Your mother was part of the investigation. She was working as a saloon girl in a town called Broken Creek, gathering information about the gang's plans." Eliza's world tilted on its axis. Her mother, a saloon girl. Her father, a federal marshal. Everything she'd believed about her family's history was crumbling around her. "That's impossible," she whispered. Jake pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "This is my uncle's final report, written just before he died. He never submitted it because he was protecting the people he loved. Your parents were killed because they got too close to the truth about who was really behind the robberies." With shaking hands, Eliza unfolded the document. The official letterhead of the United States Marshal Service was clearly visible, along with Samuel's signature and seal. The report detailed a complex conspiracy involving stolen gold, murdered witnesses, and a corrupt businessman who'd used his respectable front to cover years of criminal activity. The businessman's name was Marcus Blackwood. "My God," Eliza breathed. "Blackwood killed my parents?" "Not directly," Jake said, "but he ordered their deaths when they discovered he was the mastermind behind the robberies. Your father and my uncle were supposed to arrest him, but someone warned Blackwood. Your parents had to run, and they ended up here, hoping to disappear. But my mother died in childbirth." "No," Jake said gently. "She died from a bullet wound that became infected. Your father told everyone it was childbirth complications to protect your identity. He was afraid Blackwood would come looking for you someday." The truth crashed over her like a wave. Her entire life had been built on lies-loving lies, told to protect her, but lies nonetheless. Her parents had been heroes, not simple ranchers. They died fighting for justice, not from disease and accident. "The map," she said suddenly, "what does it really lead to?" Jake's expression grew grim. "Evidence," he said. "Enough evidence to bring down Blackwood's entire operation and prove what really happened to your parents. But it's hidden in a place that's guarded by men who shoot first and ask questions later." "Then we go get it," Eliza said, surprised by her own determination. "We?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Miss Henderson, this isn't a game. Blackwood has killed to protect his secrets before. He won't hesitate to kill again." "Then he'll have to kill me," Eliza said, folding the map and tucking it into her shirt. "Because I'm not running away like my parents did. I'm going to finish what they started." Jake studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Samuel said you had your mother's strength and your father's stubbornness. I can see he was right." He extended his hand. "Partners." Eliza shook his hand, feeling the calluses of a working man. "Partners. But if you're lying to me, Mr. Morrison, I'll shoot you myself." "I'd expect nothing less," Jake replied. "Now, we'd better get moving. Blackwood's men will be back, and next time they won't be so polite." As they prepared to leave the cabin that had been her home for 28 years, Eliza felt the weight of her parents' legacy settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just a struggling rancher trying to survive. She was the daughter of heroes, carrying on a fight that had been interrupted but never finished. The adventure Samuel Carter had promised her was about to begin, and with it, the chance to reclaim not just a treasure, but the truth about her family and the justice her parents had died trying to achieve. The afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows of the cabin as Eliza gathered the few belongings she could carry. Jake Morrison watched from the doorway, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. They'd agreed to leave before nightfall, but first, Eliza needed to search for any other clues her father might have left behind. "There's something else," she said, kneeling beside the loose floorboard where her father had hidden his most precious possessions. "I found this after he died, but I never understood what it meant." Her fingers closed around a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. She'd read it countless times over the years, but the entries had seemed like the ramblings of a sick man. Now, with Jake's revelations fresh in her mind, she saw them in a new light. Jake moved closer as she opened the journal to a page marked with a pressed flower. Her father's handwriting was shaky here, written during his final illness, but the words were clear enough. "The children of Helena's betrayal are still out there. Blackwood's reach extends further than we ever imagined. Samuel has the proof, but it's hidden where only the family can find it. The silver medallion will show the way when the time comes. Trust no one who doesn't know the story of the three sisters Helena, Grace, and Faith. They hold the key to everything." Eliza looked up at Jake, her heart pounding. "Three sisters. My mother was Helena, but who were Grace and Faith?" Jake's face had gone pale. "Grace was my mother," he said slowly. "Faith was—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "This is more complicated than I thought." "What do you mean?" "The three women weren't just working the same case," Jake said. "They were sisters, real sisters, which means you and I are cousins, Eliza." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Family. She'd been alone for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to have blood relatives. "But why didn't Samuel tell me? Why didn't you say anything?" "Because we weren't sure," Jake replied. "The records were destroyed when the gang was broken up. We suspected there was a connection, but we needed proof." He pointed to the journal. "What else does it say about the medallion?" Eliza flipped through the pages, her father's words taking on new meaning with each entry. Here he mentions hiding something in the old well behind the barn. Something that would prove our family's claim to justice. They made their way to the abandoned well, its wooden frame weathered and cracked. Jake lowered himself into the shallow depths while Eliza kept watch. After several minutes of searching, his voice echoed from below. "Found it," he called out. "There's a metal box wedged into the stones." When he emerged, he was holding a rusted tin container about the size of a jewelry box. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a silver medallion bearing the image of three women standing together. On the back, an inscription read, "Helena, Grace, faith united in purpose, divided by fate." "It's beautiful," Eliza whispered, running her fingers over the intricate metalwork. "But what does it have to do with the treasure?" Jake examined the medallion more closely. "Look at the edges," he said. "There are tiny notches cut into the silver. This isn't just jewelry, it's a key." Before Eliza could respond, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. Through the trees, she could see riders coming fast too many to be bounty hunters, too organized to be casual travelers. Blackwood's men had returned in force. "We need to go," Jake said, grabbing her arm. "Now." They ran for the horses, but it was too late. A dozen riders surrounded the cabin, their guns drawn and ready. Marcus Blackwood himself sat astride a magnificent black stallion, his face cold with determination. "Miss Henderson," he called out, "I'm afraid our morning conversation was interrupted. I've come back to finish our business." Eliza's hand moved to her gun, but Jake caught her wrist. "Too many," he whispered. "We need to be smart about this." "Mr. Blackwood," Eliza said, stepping forward with the medallion hidden in her closed fist. "You're trespassing on my land?" "Your land?" Blackwood laughed. "I'm afraid not. As of this afternoon, the bank has foreclosed on your mortgage." This property now belongs to me." He held up a legal document. "Everything on it belongs to me as well." "That's impossible. I haven't received any notice." "Banks move quickly when they have reason to believe their interests are threatened." Blackwood cut her off. "And harboring fugitives from justice is definitely a threat to their interests." One of his men spoke up. "Found tracks leading to the well, boss. Looks like they were digging for something." Blackwood's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "How convenient, Mr. Morrison, isn't it? I've heard interesting things about you. Federal Marshal Jake Morrison, working undercover to investigate certain business practices in the territory." Jake's expression didn't change, but Eliza felt him tense beside her. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," Blackwood said. "Just like Miss Henderson doesn't know anything about the map Samuel Carter left her. Just like neither of you know anything about the evidence that could destroy everything I've built." "We don't have anything that belongs to you," Eliza said. "Everything Samuel Carter ever touched belongs to me." Blackwood snarled. "That old fool thought he could hide from his past, but the past always catches up eventually. He took something from me 15 years ago, and I want it back." "What did he take?" Jake asked. Blackwood's smile was cold as winter. "My future, my fortune, my reputation. Samuel Carter and his partners cost me everything when they arrested my associates and seized my gold. I've spent 15 years rebuilding what they destroyed, and I won't let his dying gesture ruin me again." "So you admit it," Eliza said. "You were behind the robberies. You killed my parents. Your parents were fools who meddled in affairs they didn't understand." Blackwood replied. "They could have lived quietly and raised their daughter in peace. Instead, they chose to play heroes. Heroes die, Miss Henderson. It's what they do." The words hit Eliza like a slap, and suddenly the anger that had been building inside her all day erupted. "You're going to pay for what you did to them." "With what?" Blackwood laughed. "You have no proof, no evidence, no power. You're a poor rancher who's about to lose everything she owns. I'm a respected businessman with friends in high places. Who do you think people will believe?" "They'll believe the truth," Jake said quietly. "The truth is what I say it is," Blackwood replied. "And the truth is that Samuel Carter was a dangerous criminal who died while threatening an innocent woman. The truth is that his accomplices tried to steal from my property and had to be stopped. The truth is whatever I need it to be." He nodded to his men, who began to close in. "Search them, find whatever Carter left behind, and if they resist," he shrugged, "well, accidents happen on the frontier." As the hired guns advanced, Eliza felt the weight of the medallion in her palm. Whatever happened next, she couldn't let Blackwood get his hands on it. The medallion was the key to everything: the treasure, the truth, the justice her parents had died trying to achieve. "Jake," she whispered, slipping the medallion into his hand. "Whatever happens, don't let him get this." Jake's fingers closed around the silver disc. "I won't," he promised, "but we're not done fighting yet." The first gunman reached for Eliza's rifle, and she made her choice. Instead of submitting, she drove her elbow into his stomach and rolled away from his grasp. Jake drew his gun at the same moment, and suddenly the quiet afternoon exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from all directions as Jake and Eliza dove for cover behind the well. Bullets splintered the wooden frame and sent chips of stone flying. They were outnumbered 6-1, with limited ammunition and no way to escape. "This isn't going to end well," Jake shouted over the gunfire. "Maybe not," Eliza replied, checking her rifle, "but I'm not going down without a fight." As the sun began to set over the Montana Territory, the battle for Samuel Carter's legacy had begun in earnest. Whatever secrets the medallion held, whatever treasure awaited them, Eliza Mae Henderson had chosen to fight for the truth her parents had died protecting. The quiet life of a struggling rancher was over. The adventure of a lifetime was just beginning. The gunfight lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Jake Morrison's aim was true, and his tactical experience showed as he systematically picked off Blackwood's men from behind the well. Eliza found herself moving with instincts she didn't know she possessed, reloading and firing, with the precision her father had taught her during long afternoons of target practice. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Blackwood's men lay motionless in the dirt, and the rest had taken cover behind the barn. Blackwood himself had retreated to a safe distance, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over, Henderson," he shouted. "I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth before I let you destroy everything I've built." "Then you'll have to catch us first," Eliza called back, surprising herself with her boldness. Jake grabbed her arm. "The horses," he said. "We need to move while they're regrouping." They ran for their mounts, keeping low as scattered shots followed them. Jake's horse was a sturdy bay gelding that looked like it had seen hard travel. Eliza's mare, Sunset, was older, but had the kind of endurance that came from years of ranch work. As they rode hard toward the tree line, Eliza looked back at the cabin that had been her home for 28 years. Smoke was rising from the windows. Blackwood's men were burning it down, destroying the last traces of her old life. The sight should have brought tears, but instead she felt a strange sense of liberation. "Where are we going?" she asked Jake as they pushed their horses through the dense forest. "First, we need to get far enough away to study the map properly," he replied. "Then we follow Samuel's trail to the treasure." They rode in silence for an hour, putting distance between themselves and Blackwood's men. When they finally stopped to rest the horses at a hidden stream, Jake pulled out the medallion and examined it by the fading light. "The notches," he said, pointing to the tiny marks along the edge. "They correspond to landmarks on the map." "Look!" He held the medallion against the map, and the notches aligned perfectly with several of the strange symbols Samuel had drawn. "It's ingenious," Eliza breathed. "The map alone wouldn't be enough. You need both pieces to find the treasure." Jake nodded. Samuel was always careful. He knew that if anything happened to him, the treasure would be safe, unless the right person came looking for it. "And we're the right people?" "We're family," Jake said simply. That's what mattered to him. As they prepared to make camp for the night, Eliza found herself studying her newly discovered cousin. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd spent years in dangerous situations. But there was something gentle about him too, something that reminded her of her father. "Tell me about your mother," she said as they gathered wood for a fire. "Tell me about Grace." Jake's expression softened. "She was beautiful, like yours, strong, willed, determined to make the world a better place. She became a teacher after the case ended, said she wanted to help children learn to read so they could fight ignorance with knowledge." "What happened to her?" "Consumption. 5 years ago, she made me promise to find Samuel and settle the old debts. She never got over what happened to Helena and your father." Eliza felt a pang of sadness for the aunt she'd never known. "And Faith?" Jake's face clouded. "Faith chose a different path. She married a wealthy man from San Francisco and tried to forget everything that happened. She died in a carriage accident 3 years ago, but some people say it wasn't an accident." "Blackwood?" "Maybe. Or maybe she just couldn't live with the memories anymore." Jake poked at the fire with a stick. "That's why this matters so much, Eliza. We're the last of the 3 sisters' children. If we don't finish what they started, no one will." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Eliza felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, but also something else, sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. "The first cache," she said, spreading the map on the ground between them. "According to this, it's about a day's ride north in Devil's Canyon." Jake traced the route with his finger. "That's rough country. Lots of places for an ambush, and the terrain is treacherous. If Blackwood's men are following us—" "They are," Eliza said with certainty. "He won't give up that easily." "Then we need to be smarter than they are." Jake studied the map more carefully. "This symbol here, near the canyon in transit, looks like a warning mark. Samuel wouldn't have put it there without reason." "What kind of warning?" "The kind that keeps honest people away and dishonest people dead." Jake looked up at her. "Are you sure you want to do this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Blackwood will never stop hunting us." Eliza thought of her parents, of the life they'd sacrificed for justice. She thought of Samuel Carter, dying in her arms to deliver a message about debts and promises. She thought of the burned cabin and the foreclosed mortgage and the certain knowledge that running away would solve nothing. "I'm sure," she said, "but I need to know something first. Are you really a federal marshal?" Jake's smile was rueful. I resigned my commission 6 months ago to investigate Samuel's case. Officially, I'm just a concerned citizen seeking justice for his family. And unofficially? Unofficially, I'm a man who's tired of watching criminals prosper while good people suffer. He met her eyes across the fire. My badge didn't give me the authority to do what needs to be done, but family does. They shared a moment of understanding. Two people who'd lost everything to the same evil man, now united by blood and purpose. Eliza felt something stirring in her chest, not just determination, but something warmer. Jake Morrison was handsome in a weathered, honest way that reminded her of the heroes in the dime novels she'd read as a girl. "We should take turns on watch," Jake said, seemingly unaware of her thoughts. "Blackwood's men might try to track us in the dark." Eliza nodded, pulling her father's coat tighter around her shoulders. "Jake, thank you for coming when you did. If you hadn't shown up, you would have found another way," he said confidently. "Samuel was right about you having your mother's strength. I saw it today when you stood up to Blackwood." As the fire died down to glowing embers, Eliza lay on her bedroll and stared up at the stars. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. She had family, purpose, and hope. The treasure might be real, or it might be a dream, but the chance for justice was worth any risk. Tomorrow, they would ride into Devil's Canyon and begin unraveling the mystery Samuel Carter had died to preserve. Tonight, she would rest and prepare for whatever dangers lay ahead. The silver medallion pressed against her chest, where she'd hidden it beneath her shirt, warm from her body heat. Somewhere in the darkness, she could hear Jake moving quietly around their camp, keeping watch with the vigilance of a man who'd learned to trust no one completely. But she trusted him. Family was all they had left, and family was enough. The morning brought grey skies and the scent of rain on the wind. Eliza woke to find Jake already studying the map, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. He'd been up most of the night, she realized, keeping watch while she slept. "Devil's Canyon is about 6 hours north," he said, without looking up. "But I've been thinking about this coded message Samuel left." He pointed to a series of numbers and letters, written in faint pencil along the map's border. "It's not random. There's a pattern here." Eliza moved closer, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. The warmth felt good against her cold fingers. "What kind of pattern?" "Military code," Jake said. "Something they taught us in the Marshal Service for sending secure messages. If I'm reading this right, Samuel wasn't just hiding treasure, he was hiding evidence that could destroy Blackwood's entire network." He pulled out a pencil and began working out the code on the back of an old envelope. After several minutes, words began to emerge. Bank records hidden with gold, Blackwood's partners named, federal evidence vault 7 miles past canyon mouth, trust the banker's daughter when moon is full. Eliza stared at the decoded message. "Bank records? What bank?" "The Territorial Bank in Helena," Jake said grimly. "The same bank that just foreclosed on your ranch, and I'll bet the banker's daughter is someone we haven't met yet." They broke camp quickly, aware that every hour gave Blackwood more time to organize pursuit. As they rode north through increasingly rough terrain, Eliza found herself stealing glances at Jake. The morning light caught the strong lines of his face, and she noticed the way he unconsciously checked their surroundings, every few minutes the habits of a man who'd lived with danger. "Tell me about being a marshal," she said as they navigated a narrow trail between towering rock formations. Jake was quiet for a moment. It was good work, mostly, tracking down men who thought they could escape justice by heading west. But there was too much politics, too many compromises with men like Blackwood who had money and influence. "Is that why you quit?" "I quit because I realized the badge wasn't enough. Some crimes require a more personal kind of justice." The trail began to climb steeply, winding through pine forests that blocked most of the sky. Eliza's mare was breathing hard, but she was tough and used to mountain travel. Jake's horse seemed equally at home in the rough country. As they crested a ridge, the landscape opened up before them, a vast canyon system carved by centuries of wind and water. In the distance, Eliza could see the distinctive rock formation that Samuel had marked on his map, a towering spire that looked like a woman's profile against the grey sky. "Devil's Canyon," Jake said. "Legend says it got its name because so many people who go in never come out." "Cheerful," Eliza muttered, but she was studying the terrain with growing excitement. Somewhere down there was the first piece of Samuel's puzzle evidence that could bring down the man who'd killed her parents. They made their way down into the canyon, following game trails that wound between massive boulders and stunted trees. The rock walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating an echo chamber that amplified every sound. Eliza found herself speaking in whispers, though she couldn't say why. "There," Jake said, pointing to a narrow side canyon barely wide enough for a horse and rider. "That matches the drawing on the map." The passage was so tight, they had to dismount and lead their horses through single file. The walls pressed in on either side, and Eliza began to understand why Devil's Canyon had such a fearsome reputation. It would be easy to get lost in here, easier still to be trapped by enemies with high ground. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, the passage opened into a hidden valley about the size of a small ranch. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock walls, and a clear spring bubbled up from underground to form a small pond. It was beautiful and mysterious, untouched by the outside world. "According to the map," Jake said, "the cache should be near those fallen rocks on the far side of the spring." They tied the horses and approached the indicated spot cautiously. Using the medallion as a key, Jake measured distances and angles until he found what he was looking for, cleverly concealed opening behind a boulder that looked like it had been there since the mountains were young. Inside the natural cave, they found Samuel's first gift, a metal strongbox hidden beneath a pile of carefully arranged stones. Jake lifted it out with reverent hands, and Eliza held her breath as he opened the lock with a key hidden inside the medallion's design. The box contained more than just gold, though there was plenty of that coins and nuggets worth more than Eliza had ever imagined. But the real treasure was the documentation, bank records showing transfers of stolen money, correspondence between Blackwood and his criminal associates, and detailed records of bribes paid to corrupt officials. "My God," Eliza whispered, reading through a letter that outlined plans to kill 3 federal marshals working undercover in Broken Creek. He planned it all. Every murder, every robbery, every cover-up. Jake held up a photograph that made his hands shake with anger. It showed Blackwood shaking hands with a group of men Eliza recognized from wanted posters, the most notorious outlaws in the territory. This proves he was their leader, not just a fence for stolen goods. But the most shocking discovery was a birth certificate for a girl named Faith Morrison, born to Eliza Henderson and adopted by a wealthy San Francisco family. The certificate bore official seals and signatures, including one from a judge who was known to be in Blackwood's pocket. "Faith wasn't your mother's sister," Eliza said slowly. "She was my sister, my twin sister." Jake stared at the document in amazement. That means I'm not alone," Eliza finished. "I had family I never knew about, and Blackwood made sure we never found each other." Tears stung her eyes as she thought of the sister who died alone in San Francisco, never knowing she had family who would have loved and protected her. The sound of voices echoing through the canyon interrupted their revelations. Jake quickly stuffed the documents back into the strongbox while Eliza gathered the gold. They had what they came for, but they weren't alone anymore. "How many?" Jake whispered, drawing his gun. Eliza listened carefully to the approaching voices. "At least 6, maybe more, and they know exactly where we are." They had 2 choices: try to escape through the narrow passage they'd entered by, or make a stand in the hidden valley. Either way, they'd be outnumbered and outgunned by men who had no interest in taking prisoners. "The other passage," Jake said, pointing to what looked like another opening on the far side of the valley. "It's not on the map, but it might lead out of here." They loaded their saddlebags with the most important documents and as much gold as they could carry, then led their horses toward the unknown passage. Behind them, the voices were getting closer, and Eliza could hear the distinctive sound of iron horseshoes on stone. As they entered the dark passage, she looked back at the beautiful hidden valley where Samuel Carter had kept his secret safe for 15 years. Whatever happened next, they now had the evidence they needed to destroy Marcus Blackwood. But first, they had to survive long enough to use it. The passage through the rock was treacherous, barely wide enough for their horses, and filled with loose stones that threatened to betray their position with every step. Eliza could hear Blackwood's men behind them, their voices echoing off the canyon walls as they discovered the hidden valley. "They found the cave," Jake whispered, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they realize we took the back way out." The narrow tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and climbing through the heart of the mountain. At times they had to duck to avoid low-hanging rocks, and once Jake had to physically lift Eliza over a gap in the stone floor. The horses were nervous, their hooves slipping on the smooth rock, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that capture meant death. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, they emerged onto a ledge high above Devil's Canyon. The view was breathtaking. They could see for miles across the Montana Territory, all the way to the distant peaks of the Rockies. But they had no time to appreciate the scenery. "There!" Eliza pointed to a plume of dust rising from the canyon floor. "They're following our trail." Jake studied the terrain below them. "We need to get to higher ground and circle back toward the territorial road. Once we reach civilization, they won't dare attack us openly." They began the dangerous descent down the far side of the mountain, following deer trails that were barely wide enough for a human, let alone a horse. Eliza's mare, Sunset, proved her worth on the treacherous path, picking her way carefully over loose rocks and steep drops. Jake's gelding was equally sure-footed, but the strain was showing on both animals. As they worked their way down the mountainside, Jake began to share more of what he'd learned about Blackwood's operation during his months of investigation. "He's not just a territorial crime boss," Jake explained as they paused to rest the horses. "He's connected to a network that stretches from California to Colorado. Stolen gold, murdered witnesses, corrupted official sits bigger than anything Samuel and your parents originally investigated." "How big?" "Big enough that taking him down will require more than just local law enforcement. We'll need federal intervention, maybe even territorial government involvement." Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You're talking about something that could take years. Or it could happen very quickly, if we can get the evidence to the right people," Jake said. "The banker's daughter that Samuel mentioned in his code, I think she might be our key to exposing the whole conspiracy." They resumed their descent, but the going was getting more difficult. The horses were tired, and storm clouds were gathering overhead, threatening rain that would make the rocky trails even more dangerous. Eliza was beginning to think they might not make it to safety when Jake suddenly held up his hand. "Listen," he said. In the distance, they could hear the sound of approaching horses, not from behind them, but from ahead. Someone was climbing up from the valley below, moving fast and with purpose. "More of Blackwood's men?" Eliza asked. Jake shook his head, his expression puzzled. "I don't think so. The timing's wrong, and they're not trying to be quiet." A few minutes later, they had their answer. A young woman on a paint horse came into view around a bend in the trail, riding with the confidence of someone who knew these mountains well. She was probably 25, with auburn hair braided down her back, and the kind of clothes that suggested both prosperity and practicality. "You folks look like you could use some help," she called out as she approached. "I'm Catherine Banks. My father owns the Territorial Bank in Helena." Jake and Eliza exchanged glances, the banker's daughter exactly, who Samuel's coded message had told them to trust. "Miss Banks," Jake said carefully, "what brings you up here?" "I've been watching for you," Catherine replied. "Samuel Carter visited my father 3 weeks ago and left instructions. If anyone came looking for information about Marcus Blackwood's accounts, I was to provide assistance." "Your father helped Samuel?" Eliza asked. Catherine's expression grew grim. My father has been gathering evidence against Blackwood for 2 years. Blackwood forced him to foreclose on honest people's properties and launder money through illegal loans. Dad finally had enough and started keeping records. Records that could prove Blackwood's criminal activities. Records that could put him in federal prison for the rest of his life. Catherine confirmed. But Dad's been too frightened to act. Blackwood has threatened our family, and he has the sheriff in his pocket. Jake looked back toward the canyon, where the dust cloud was getting closer. Miss Banks, we need to get out of these mountains. Blackwood's men are tracking us, and they're not interested in taking prisoners. I know a safe route, Catherine said. Follow me. She led them down a hidden trail that was invisible from below, a path that wound through stands of pine trees and across rocky outcroppings that would leave no tracks. It was clear she'd used this route before, probably to avoid unwanted attention from Blackwood's men. As they rode, Catherine shared what she knew about Blackwood's operations. Her father's bank had been forced to handle transactions for a network of criminals that stretched across 3 states. Gold stolen from mines, money from bank robberies, profits from illegal gambling and prostitution, it all flowed through accounts that Blackwood controlled. The worst part, Catherine said, is that he's been using the bank to foreclose on honest people's property, then selling it to his criminal associates for development. Your ranch was just the latest in a long line of thefts disguised as legal business. Eliza felt a surge of anger. Her family's ranch hadn't been lost to bad luck or poor management, it had been stolen as part of a deliberate conspiracy. The foreclosure that had seemed like the end of her world was actually just another crime in Blackwood's long list of offenses. What about the evidence? Jake asked. Where is your father keeping the records? In a secret vault beneath the bank, Catherine replied. Samuel helped him design it. The combination requires both a key and a specific date, the date Eliza Henderson died. The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. Even 15 years later, her mother's death was still part of the fight for justice. Samuel Carter had made sure that Eliza would be the only person who could access the final pieces of evidence needed to destroy Blackwood. There's something else, Catherine continued. Samuel left a message for his family. He said to tell you that the debt is finally paid and Helena's daughters can rest in peace. Daughters, plural. The revelation about Faith being her twin sister was still fresh, but now Eliza understood the full scope of what had been taken from her. She'd lost not just her parents, but her sister, her heritage, and 15 years of family she could have known and loved. They reached the bottom of the mountain as the sun was setting, emerging onto a well-traveled road that led toward Helena. In the distance, Eliza could see the lights of the territorial capital, a beacon of civilization after their harrowing escape through Devil's Canyon. We'll rest tonight at my family's house, Catherine said. Tomorrow, we'll open the vault and gather everything we need to bring down Marcus Blackwood once and for all. As they rode toward town, Eliza felt the weight of the silver medallion against her chest and the responsibility of carrying on her parents' fight. The hidden cache had provided evidence and gold, but the real treasure was the knowledge that she wasn't alone in her quest for justice. With Jake beside her and Catherine guiding them, she finally had allies who understood what was at stake. Tomorrow, they would take the fight to Blackwood on his own territory. Tonight, for the first time in her adult life, she would sleep knowing that family was nearby and justice was within reach. The Banks family home was a substantial 2-story house on the respectable side of Helena, with gas lamps in the windows and a wrought-iron fence that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Catherine's father, William Banks, was a distinguished man in his 50s with prematurely grey hair and the kind of worried expression that comes from years of carrying dangerous secrets. Miss Henderson, he said as they gathered in his study after dinner, Samuel Carter spoke of you often during our meetings. He was very proud of the woman you'd become, even though he could never reveal his connection to your family. Eliza sat forward in her chair, still struggling to understand the full scope of the conspiracy that had shaped her life. Mr. Banks, how long did you know Samuel? 20 years, Banks replied. He saved my life during the war, and we stayed in touch afterward. When I came west to establish the bank, he helped me understand which businessmen could be trusted and which ones were hiding criminal enterprises. Jake studied the older man carefully. But you ended up doing business with Blackwood anyway. Banks's face flushed with shame. I had no choice. Blackwood had evidence of certain irregularities in my early business practices. Nothing criminal, you understand, but embarrassing enough to ruin my reputation. He used that leverage to force me to handle his transactions. What kind of irregularities? Eliza asked gently. I may have been too lenient with loan approvals for war widows and struggling families. Banks admitted. Technically against bank policy, but morally the right thing to do. Blackwood threatened to expose these acts of charity as evidence of financial irresponsibility. Catherine moved to stand beside her father's chair. That's when Dad started keeping detailed records of everything Blackwood forced him to do. Every illegal transaction, every forged document, every bribber documented it all. And Samuel helped you hide the evidence? Samuel designed the vault system, Banks confirmed. He said that someday Helena's daughter would come looking for the truth. The vault can only be opened by someone who knows the exact date of your mother's death and has the silver medallion to serve as a key. Banks led them to the basement of the house, where a seemingly ordinary wine cellar concealed the entrance to something far more significant. Hidden behind a false wall was a steel door that looked like it belonged in a federal bank, not a private home. Samuel spared no expense, Banks explained as he began working the combination lock. This vault is fireproof, waterproof, and virtually impossible to break into without the proper keys. The massive door swung open to reveal a room lined with steel filing cabinets and a large safe. Catherine lit several oil lamps, revealing the scope of her father's documentation project. Hundreds of files filled the cabinets, each one meticulously labeled and organized. "My God," Jake breathed, pulling out a file marked Blackwood Associates, murder contracts. This is enough evidence to convict half the criminal population of the Western Territories. But it was the large safe that held the most shocking revelations. Using the silver medallion as a key, Eliza opened the heavy door to reveal stacks of legal documents that made her head spin. Deeds to properties throughout the territory, all bearing forged signatures and fraudulent seals. Bank records showing millions of dollars in stolen gold flowing through accounts controlled by Blackwood and his associates. And at the bottom of the pile, a collection of documents that changed everything she thought she knew about her family's story. "These are original federal marshal commissions," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for Thomas Henderson, Samuel Carter, and—" She stopped, staring at the third name on the list. William Banks. The banker's face went pale. "You weren't supposed to see those." Jake moved closer, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "You were a federal marshal? You were part of the original investigation?" "I was the third member of the team," Banks admitted. "Thomas and Samuel were the field agents, but I was the one who handled financial investigations and evidence gathering. When the case went wrong and your parents were killed, I was ordered to establish a new identity and continue monitoring Blackwood's operations." Eliza felt the world spinning around her. "You've been watching Blackwood for 15 years? You could have stopped him at any time, but you let him continue killing and stealing." "I was gathering evidence," Banks said desperately. "Building an airtight case that would bring down his entire network, not just Blackwood himself. If I'd acted too soon, his associates would have scattered and continued their operations elsewhere." "While you were gathering evidence," Jake said coldly, "how many people died? How many families lost everything they owned?" Catherine stepped between her father and the accusations. "He saved more people than you know. Every family he approved for lenient loans, every warning he passed to honest businessmen about Blackwood's scheme. She's been fighting this war in his own way." But Eliza was staring at another document that made her blood run cold. It was a death certificate for Faith Morrison, dated 3 years earlier, signed by a doctor in San Francisco. The cause of death was listed as accidental poisoning, but there was a note attached in Banks's handwriting. Autopsy results confirm murder by strychnine. Investigation suppressed by local authorities at request of unnamed federal official. Faith was murdered, she said, her voice hollow with shock. My sister was murdered, and you covered it up. Banks's shoulders sagged with the weight of 15 years of secrets. Faith had started asking questions about her adoption. She hired a private investigator to trace her birth parents. Blackwood found out and had her killed before she could discover the truth about Helena and Thomas. And you let him get away with it. I documented it, Banks said. Every detail, every piece of evidence. Faith's murder was the final proof I needed that Blackwood would kill anyone who threatened his empire, including innocent family members. Jake grabbed Banks by the shirt and pushed him against the wall. You used her death as evidence instead of preventing it. What kind of lawman are you? The kind who understands that sometimes you have to sacrifice individuals to save hundreds of others, Banks replied, his voice steady, despite the gun pointed at his chest. Faith's death was tragic, but it gave us the proof we needed to bring down a criminal organization that has killed dozens of people. Eliza felt tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the full scope of the betrayal. Her sister had died because she'd tried to find her family. Faith had been murdered by the same man who'd killed their parents, and the federal government had covered it up to protect an ongoing investigation. There's more, Catherine said quietly, holding up a file marked Current Operations. Dad hasn't been passive all these years. He's been feeding information to other federal agents, helping them track down Blackwood's associates across multiple states. The file contained correspondence with U.S. Marshals in Colorado, California, and Wyoming. Banks had been part of a coordinated federal effort to dismantle the entire criminal network, not just the territorial operations. Dozens of arrests had been made based on information he'd provided, and millions of dollars in stolen property had been recovered. The operation is nearly complete, Banks explained. We've identified all of Blackwood's major associates and gathered enough evidence to convict them all. Your arrival with Samuel's final evidence was the signal we'd been waiting for, the go-ahead to move against the entire organization simultaneously. Jake released Banks and stepped back, his expression a mixture of anger and grudging respect. You're saying this was all planned? Samuel's death, Eliza's involvement, everything? Samuel was dying of cancer, Banks said gently. He had maybe 6 months to live. He chose to spend his final weeks delivering the evidence to Eliza and setting up the final phase of the operation. His death on her doorstep wasn't an accident, it was a carefully planned signal that the time for action had finally come. Eliza sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd learned. Her entire life had been shaped by a federal investigation that had lasted longer than she'd been alive. Samuel Carter hadn't been a dying gunslinger seeking redemption. He'd been an undercover federal agent, completing a mission that had cost him everything he'd loved. The deed to Blackwood's empire, she said, remembering the code from Samuel's map. What does that mean? Banks reached into the safe and pulled out a thick folder bound with ribbon. Marcus Blackwood doesn't own anything, he said. Every property, every business, every asset is held in the name of shell companies that we've been tracking for years. When we arrest him, the federal government will seize everything he's stolen and return it to the rightful owners. Including my ranch. Including your ranch, Banks confirmed, and Faith's inheritance from her adoptive parents, and dozens of other properties stolen through fraudulent foreclosures. You won't just get justice for your family, you'll help restore justice for hundreds of families who've lost everything to Blackwood's schemes. Catherine handed Eliza a glass of water and sat beside her. I know this is overwhelming, but you have to understand your parents didn't die for nothing. Their sacrifice made this investigation possible, and now you're going to finish what they started. As Eliza stared at the evidence that filled the vault, she realized that Samuel Carter's final words had been more prophetic than she'd imagined. The treasure he'd promised wasn't just gold and property, it was the restoration of justice for countless victims and the completion of a mission that had defined her family's legacy for 15 years. Tomorrow, the federal marshals would move against Blackwood and his associates. Tonight, She finally understood who she really was. Not just the daughter of murdered ranchers, but the daughter of heroes who'd given their lives to protect innocent people from a vast criminal conspiracy. The debt Samuel had spoken of wasn't just paid, it was about to bear interest that would echo across the entire Western Territory. Dawn broke grey and cold over Helena, with snow flurries dancing in the wind that promised a harsh winter ahead. Eliza stood at the window of the bank's house, watching federal marshals take positions around the town. The coordinated operation that William Banks had described was already in motion, with lawmen moving quietly into position for what would be the largest criminal takedown in territorial history. Samuel's final plan lay spread across the dining room, a detailed strategy that he'd spent months perfecting before his death. Every aspect had been carefully considered: the timing of arrests, the sequence of raids, the coordination with federal agents in other states. It was the work of a master tactician who'd understood that bringing down Blackwood's empire would require precision and overwhelming force. The key is simultaneity, Banks explained as he reviewed the plan with Jake and Eliza. Blackwood has escape routes planned and associates ready to disappear at the first sign of trouble. We have one chance to catch them all, and it has to happen at exactly the same time across 3 states. Jake studied the detailed timeline. What's our role in all this? You're the bait, Banks said bluntly. Blackwood knows you have Samuel's evidence, and he'll do anything to get it back. We need him to come to us, in a place where we can control the situation and ensure the safety of innocent bystanders. Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. You want us to face him directly? Not just face him, Catherine said, joining the conversation. Confront him with the evidence of his crimes and give him a chance to surrender. Federal law requires that we offer the opportunity for peaceful resolution before using force. And if he doesn't surrender? Banks's expression was grim. Then we end this the way it should have ended 15 years ago. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Eliza and Jake would return to the ruins of her ranch, where Blackwood would expect them to make their final stand. The location was isolated enough to prevent civilian casualties, but accessible enough for federal agents to surround without being detected. Samuel had chosen it specifically because the terrain favored defenders with superior knowledge of the ground. He'll come with everything he has, Jake warned. Blackwood's not the kind of man who accepts defeat gracefully. Let him come, Eliza said, surprised by her own calm. I've been running from this fight my whole life. It's time to face it, head on. As they prepared for the confrontation, Catherine pulled Eliza aside. There's something else you need to know about the evidence. Something Dad hasn't told you yet. What? The federal government has been tracking stolen gold from the California mines for over 20 years. Some of it has never been recovered. Millions of dollars worth that disappeared during the original robberies. Samuel's final cache contains more than just evidence about Blackwood's current crimes. Eliza felt her heart racing. It contains the location of the missing gold? All of it, Catherine confirmed. Enough to make you one of the wealthiest women in the territory, but more importantly, enough to compensate every family that Blackwood has robbed over the years. The weight of responsibility settled on Eliza's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was carrying more than just evidences. He was carrying the hopes and dreams of hundreds of families who'd lost everything to Blackwood's greed. They rode out of Helena as the sun climbed toward its zenith, 3 riders carrying the hopes of a territory and the ghosts of too many victims. The journey back to Eliza's ranch took them through country that had seemed wild and empty just days before, but now felt populated with hidden watchers and unseen allies. Federal marshals were already in position around the ranch when they arrived. Eliza could see them if she knew where to look, men with rifles stationed in the tree line, agents hidden among the rocks, a coordinated force that had been planning this moment for months. The burned ruins of her cabin stood as a stark reminder of what Blackwood was capable of when his interests were threatened. But as Eliza walked through the ashes of her old life, she felt no sadness, only determination to ensure that no other family would suffer the same loss. He's coming, Jake said, pointing to a dust cloud on the horizon. Looks like he brought an army. Through her father's old spyglass, Eliza could count at least 20 riders approaching at a steady pace. Blackwood was taking no chances. He'd brought enough firepower to deal with whatever resistance they might offer. "Remember," she said to Jake as they took positions behind the ruins of the barn, "we need him alive. The other agents won't move until they hear him confess to the murders." "And if he doesn't confess?" Eliza checked her rifle and thought of her parents, her sister, and all the other victims of Blackwood's ambition. "Then we make him confess." The riders approached, slowly, spreading out in a semicircle that would make escape impossible. Blackwood himself rode in the center, his black coat billowing in the wind like the wings of some predatory bird. Even from a distance, Eliza could see the confident smile on his face, the expression of a man who believed he'd already won. "Miss Henderson," he called out as they came within speaking distance, "I must say, you've led us quite a chase, but all adventures must come to an end." "Mr. Blackwood," Eliza replied, stepping out from behind the barn, "I've been looking forward to this conversation." "Have you indeed?" Blackwood's smile widened. "How delightful. I do hope you've brought Samuel's little treasures with you. It would be such a shame if this visit were wasted." Jake emerged from cover with the metal strongbox in his hands. "Looking for this?" "Ah, the mysterious Mr. Morrison. Or should I say, former Federal Marshal Morrison." Blackwood's voice carried a note of amusement. "Did you really think I wouldn't investigate your background? I know exactly who you are and why you're here." "Then you know this is over," Jake said. "We have everything we need to destroy your entire operation." Blackwood laughed, a sound like glass breaking in the cold air. "My dear boy, you have nothing. A few forged documents, some stolen gold, the testimony of a disgraced banker who's been embezzling from his own institution for years. Do you really think a territorial court will convict a respected businessman on such flimsy evidence?" "What about the federal evidence?" Eliza asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her stomach. "What federal evidence?" Blackwood's smile was predatory. "Poor Samuel Carter was a dying man, ravaged by cancer, and desperate to ease his conscience before meeting his maker. Who's to say he didn't fabricate those documents in a delusional attempt to blame others for his own crimes?" The confidence in his voice made Eliza's blood run cold. Blackwood had thought of everything, prepared for every eventuality. Even with all the evidence they'd gathered, he still believed he could escape justice. "You killed my parents," she said, stepping closer. "Your parents were criminals who died while resisting arrest." Blackwood replied smoothly. "I have signed statements from 3 witnesses who saw Thomas Henderson draw his gun on a federal marshal. Self-defense, nothing more." "And my sister, Faith Morrison?" For the first time, Blackwood's expression showed a flicker of genuine surprise. "Your sister? Miss Henderson, I'm afraid your grief has addled your wits. You had no sister." "Faith Morrison was my twin," Eliza said, pulling out the birth certificate they'd found in the vault. "Separated at birth and adopted by a family in San Francisco. She was murdered 3 years ago, when she started investigating her true parentage." Blackwood studied the document, his eyes narrowing. "Interesting. I wasn't aware that Helena had twins. It explains why she was so protective of her secrets." He looked up at Eliza with what might have been genuine admiration. "You know, Miss Henderson, you remind me very much of your mother. She had the same stubborn streak, the same refusal to accept reasonable offers." "What offers?" "I offered Helena a comfortable life as my mistress," Blackwood said matter-of-factly. "A house in San Francisco, fine clothes, security for her children. All she had to do was forget what she'd learned about my business affairs." The casual way he spoke about his attempted corruption of her mother made Eliza's hands shake with rage. "She chose my father instead. She chose poverty and death instead," Blackwood corrected. "A foolish decision that cost her everything she might have protected. If she'd been more reasonable, you would have grown up in luxury instead of squalor." Jake's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You're confessing to attempted bribery of a federal agent." I'm reminiscing about old times with a beautiful woman who should have chosen more wisely, Blackwood replied. There's no crime in that. But his men were getting restless, and Eliza could see some of them glancing nervously at the tree line. Professional criminals developed instincts about ambushes, and something about the situation was making them uncomfortable. "Boss," one of them called out, "this don't feel right. Too quiet, too easy." Blackwood raised his hand for silence, his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain with new wariness. "Yes, I'm beginning to sense the same thing. Miss Henderson, I don't suppose you'd care to explain why this feels like a trap." "Because it is a trap," a new voice said from behind Blackwood's men. Federal Marshal Thomas Hartley emerged from concealment, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun and his rifle trained on Blackwood's back. He was followed by a dozen other marshals, all armed and positioned to prevent escape. "Marcus Blackwood," Hartley said in a voice that carried across the ruins, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, robbery, and treason against the United States government." For a moment, the tableau held like a frozen painting 20 armed criminals surrounded by federal agents, with Eliza and Jake caught in the middle. Then Blackwood began to laugh again, the sound even more chilling than before. "Marshal Hartley," he said without turning around, "I should have expected you to orchestrate this little drama. Always were one for theatrical gestures." "Drop your weapons," Hartley commanded. "All of you. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed." "Doesn't it?" Blackwood asked. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Marshal. This was always going to end in bloodshed. The only question is whose." The criminal leader's hand moved slowly toward his gun, and Eliza realized that despite being outnumbered and surrounded, Marcus Blackwood had no intention of surrendering. He would rather die fighting than face justice for his crimes. "Wait," she called out, stepping between Blackwood and the federal marshals. "There's something you need to hear first." She pulled Samuel's final letter from her pocket, the one document she hadn't shared with anyone else. Samuel Carter left a confession, a detailed account of everything that happened 15 years ago, including the names of every federal official who helped cover up your crimes. Blackwood's confident smile faltered for the first time. "What confession?" "The confession that explains how you corrupted Judge Morrison in San Francisco to arrange Faith's adoption. How you bribed Marshal Davidson to falsify the reports about my parents' deaths. How you've been paying protection money to territorial officials for over a decade." She began reading from Samuel's letter, her voice carrying across the ruins with the authority of truth. "I, Samuel Carter, being of sound mind and facing imminent death, do hereby confess my role in the cover-up of crimes committed by Marcus Blackwood and his criminal organization. For 15 years, I have remained silent while innocent people suffered and died. No more." The letter contained names, dates, and details that made even Blackwood's hardened men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. It was a complete indictment of a conspiracy that reached from the territorial government to federal offices in Washington. "The confession is already in the hands of the Attorney General," Jake added. "Whether you surrender or not, the investigation will continue. The only question is whether you face trial or a firing squad." Blackwood's face had gone pale, but his eyes still burned with defiant rage. "You think this changes anything? You think justice matters in a world where power makes the rules?" "I think justice is all that matters," Eliza replied, "and justice is what my family has been fighting for since the day you murdered my parents." The moment stretched like a wire about to snap, with 20 federal marshals and 20 criminals, all waiting for someone to make the first move. In the center of it all stood Eliza Mae Henderson, no longer a struggling rancher, but the daughter of heroes, carrying the hopes of a territory and the promise of justice too long delayed. The final confrontation was about to begin. The silence stretched for what felt like eternity, broken only by the wind whistling through the burned timbers of Eliza's cabin. 20 federal marshals faced 20 hardened criminals in a standoff that would determine the fate of the entire territory. At the center of it all, Marcus Blackwood sat on his black stallion like some dark emperor, weighing his options with the calculating mind that had kept him alive and prosperous for so many years. "The smoking gun evidence," Marshal Hartley said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Samuel Carter didn't just leave a confession, Blackwood. He left proof." Jake reached into the strongbox and pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. "Financial records showing every bribe you've paid, every official you've corrupted, every murder you've ordered. Signed receipts, correspondence, bank transfers, all of it, documented and verified." Blackwood's confident mask was beginning to crack. Those documents could be forgeries. "They could be," Eliza agreed, stepping closer to his horse. "But they're not. And you know they're not because you've been meticulous about keeping records. Samuel told us that you never trusted your associates completely. You always kept evidence against them in case they ever turned on you." What he didn't expect, Jake continued, was that his own banker would be documenting his crimes as well. "William Banks has been copying every transaction, every transfer, every illegal deal you've forced him to process." From the tree line, Catherine Banks emerged with a leather satchel in her hands. 15 years of evidence, Mr. Blackwood. Every crime you've committed since you started using my father's bank for your money laundering operation." The criminal leader's eyes flicked from face to face, calculating odds and possibilities. Some of his men were already eyeing the federal marshals nervously, clearly beginning to understand that this wasn't a fight they could win. "Boss," one of them said quietly, "maybe we should." "Shut up," Blackwood snapped. "I'm thinking." But Eliza could see that his thinking was leading him toward violence rather than surrender. There was something in his posture, a subtle shift in his weight that reminded her of a snake coiling to strike. "You can't kill all of us," she said. "Even if you somehow fought your way out of here, there are federal agents in 3 states ready to arrest your associates. The operation is already over, Mr. Blackwood. The only question is whether you go to prison or to the grave." "Prison?" Blackwood's laugh was bitter. "Do you really think a man like me would survive a week in federal prison? Do you think the associates I'd be betraying would let me live long enough to testify?" For the first time, Eliza heard something like fear in his voice. Marcus Blackwood wasn't just a criminal. He was a man trapped by his own crimes, surrounded by enemies he'd created through years of murder and betrayal. "Then help us catch them," Marshal Hartley said. "Cooperate with the investigation. Testify against the corrupt officials. Help us clean up the mess you've made." "And spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder?" Blackwood shook his head. "I think not, Marshal. I'd rather die as Marcus Blackwood than live as a federal informant." His hand moved toward his gun, and Eliza knew the talking was over. But before anyone could draw their weapons, a new voice cut through the tension. "Daddy!" A young girl, maybe 10 years old, came running from the direction of the road. She was well-dressed and beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that looked remarkably like Blackwood's. Behind her, a woman in an expensive traveling dress was calling out in alarm. "Emily, come back here." Blackwood's face went white as the girl ran straight toward his horse, oblivious to the armed men surrounding her father. "Daddy, Mama said you were in trouble and we came to help." The criminal leader's carefully constructed world crashed down around him as he realized his family had walked into the middle of his final confrontation. His wife and daughter, the 2 people he'd been trying to protect with all his illegal schemes, were now in the line of fire. "Emily, no," he said, his voice breaking as he dismounted and caught the girl in his arms. "You shouldn't be here, sweetheart. It's not safe." "Are these the bad men Mama told me about?" Emily asked, looking around at the federal marshals with curiosity rather than fear. Marshal Hartley lowered his rifle slightly. "Nobody's going to hurt you, little miss. This is between us and your father." "My daddy's not a bad man," Emily said firmly. "He builds schools and hospitals and helps people who don't have money." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. Even as she'd been preparing to see justice done, she hadn't considered that Blackwood might have a family of innocent people who loved him and depended on him. The man she'd seen as a monster was also someone's father, someone's husband. Blackwood's wife approached slowly, her face pale with terror. "Marcus, what's happening? Who are these men?" Federal marshals, darling, Blackwood said gently. They think I've done some terrible things. Think? Eliza couldn't help herself. You killed my parents. You murdered my sister. You've destroyed dozens of families with your crimes. Mrs. Blackwood stared at her in shock. That's impossible. My husband is a businessman. He helps people. He does help people, Catherine Banks said quietly. He's donated thousands of dollars to schools and orphanages. He's built hospitals and funded churches. The question is where that money came from. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming. Marcus Blackwood wasn't just a simple villain. He was a man who'd committed terrible crimes to build what he saw as a better life for his family and community. The money he'd stolen had indeed helped innocent people, even as it destroyed others. The choice is still yours, Marshal Hartley said. Surrender peacefully and your family won't have to watch you die. Blackwood looked down at his daughter, then at his wife, then at the federal agents surrounding him. For a moment, Eliza thought he might actually surrender. Then his expression hardened with desperate resolve. I'm sorry, he said to his family. I'm sorry for everything. His hand went to his gun, and the afternoon exploded into chaos. Federal marshals shouted warnings as criminals reached for their weapons. Emily screamed as her father pushed her away from danger. Mrs. Blackwood cried out in terror as bullets began flying over their heads. But Eliza was already moving, diving toward Emily and her mother to shield them from the crossfire. Jake was beside her, his gun drawn, but aimed away from the civilians caught in the middle of the battle. The smoking gun evidence scattered across the ground as the strongbox fell from Jake's hands, but it no longer mattered. The final confrontation between justice and corruption had begun, and only one side could survive. The gunfight erupted with devastating intensity, but it was over almost before it began. Federal marshals had trained for this moment, coordinating their fire with military precision. Blackwood's men, despite their reputation as hardened criminals, were caught off guard by the overwhelming force arrayed against them. Eliza threw herself over Emily Blackwood, shielding the child with her own body as bullets whined overhead. Jake covered Mrs. Blackwood, pushing her down behind the ruins of a stone wall that had once been part of Eliza's garden. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the dust kicked up by panicking horses. "Stay down," Eliza whispered to Emily, who was sobbing in terror. "It'll be over soon." Through the chaos, she could see Marcus Blackwood fighting with the desperate courage of a man who knew he was doomed. His gun blazed as he took cover behind his fallen horse, but he was directing his fire away from where his family had taken shelter. Even in his final moments, he was trying to protect the people he loved. Marshal Hartley's voice cut through the gunfire. "Surrender, Blackwood. Your men are down. It's over." Indeed, most of the criminals were either dead or wounded. The federal agents had positioned themselves perfectly, creating crossfire zones that made resistance futile. But Blackwood continued fighting, reloading with practiced efficiency as he kept the marshals at bay. "I won't go to prison," he shouted back, "and I won't let you destroy my family's name." "Daddy, please stop," Emily cried out, her voice breaking through the sound of gunfire. "Please don't fight anymore." The desperate plea seemed to pierce through Blackwood's defenses more effectively than any bullet. He paused in his firing, looking toward where his daughter was hidden behind the stone wall. In that moment of hesitation, Eliza saw something that changed everything. Blackwood's coat had fallen open, revealing a badge pinned to his vest, a tarnished silver star that she recognized from her father's old belongings. It was a federal marshal's badge, identical to the one Thomas Henderson had carried. "My God," she breathed, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "You're a federal marshal too." The realization made Jake look up sharply. "What did you say?" "His badge," Eliza pointed. "He's carrying a federal marshal's commission. He was working undercover, just like my father." Marshal Hartley heard her words and called out to Blackwood. "Show me your badge. Show me your commission." Slowly, keeping his gun in his other hand, Blackwood reached into his coat and pulled out a leather folder. He held it up so the marshals could see the official seal and signature. "Federal Marshal Marcus Blackwood," he called out, his voice heavy with bitter irony. Deep cover assignment, duration indefinite. Authorization signed by Judge Morrison, sealed by the Attorney General's office. The gunfire had stopped completely now. Federal agents emerged from cover, their weapons still trained on Blackwood, but confusion evident on their faces. Judge Morrison, same corrupt judge who had arranged Faith's adoption, had been giving orders to federal marshals. "That's impossible," Marshal Hartley said. "Judge Morrison was exposed as corrupt years ago." "Judge Morrison was my handler," Blackwood replied. "For 15 years I've been playing the role of a criminal mastermind while documenting the real criminals in his organization. Every bribe I paid, every murder I ordered, every illegal transaction, all of it was authorized by federal command as part of a massive sting operation." Eliza felt the world spinning around her as the implications sank in. "The murders me parents, my sister, were not part of the plan," Blackwood said, his voice filled with anguish. "Your parents discovered the operation by accident. They were supposed to be extracted safely, but Judge Morrison ordered their elimination to protect the investigation. I tried to stop it, but I was too late." Jake's face had gone pale. "Faith Morrison, Judge Morrison's adopted daughter." "My sister," Blackwood whispered. "Judge Morrison adopted her to keep her close, to make sure she never learned the truth about her parentage. When she started investigating her birth family, he had her killed to protect the operation." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Judge Morrison hadn't been a corrupt official bought by criminals. She'd been the mastermind behind a federal operation that had sacrificed innocent lives in pursuit of a larger goal. "Samuel Carter," Eliza said. "Was he part of it too?" "Samuel was the only one who refused to follow Morrison's orders," Blackwood replied. "When he learned about the planned murders, he tried to warn your parents. Morrison had him hunted as a rogue agent, forced him into hiding for 15 years. Marshal Hartley stepped forward, his expression grim. "If this is true, then we've been hunting the wrong man. Judge Morrison is the real criminal." "Morrison is dead," Blackwood said. "Heart attack 6 months ago. But his network is still active, still killing people to protect their secrets. That's why I couldn't surrender. They would have eliminated me and my family before I could testify." Catherine Banks emerged from cover, her face stricken. "My father knew, didn't he? That's why he's been so frightened all these years. He knew the federal government was involved in the cover-up. William Banks has been protecting evidence against Morrison's network for years," Blackwood confirmed. "But he was too terrified to act. Morrison had agents everywhere, even in the Federal Marshal Service." Eliza looked around at the federal agents surrounding them and felt a chill of fear. "How do we know which ones we can trust?" "You can trust Marshal Hartley," Blackwood said. "He's been investigating Morrison's network independently, gathering evidence of federal corruption. My arrest was supposed to be the final piece of his case." Hartley nodded grimly. "We've been tracking Morrison's agents for 2 years. Blackwood's evidence was the key to identifying all of them." He looked at the scattered documents from the strongbox. Samuel Carter's confession named every corrupt federal official involved in the conspiracy. "Including the ones here today?" Jake asked, his hand moving toward his gun. "No," Hartley assured him. "Every agent here has been vetted and cleared. We couldn't risk Morrison's people learning about the operation." Mrs. Blackwood had been listening to the conversation with growing horror. "Marcus, is this true? Have you been living a lie for 15 years? Blackwood's shoulders sagged with the weight of his secrets. "I had to protect you and Emily. If Morrison's people had known you were my real family instead of just a cover identity, they would have killed you both." He reached into his pocket and pulled out her father's badge, the one Eliza had recognized. "This belonged to Thomas Henderson. I took it from his body 15 years ago, intending to return it to his daughter when the operation was over. I never imagined it would take this long." Eliza accepted the badge with trembling hands, feeling the weight of her father's sacrifice. "The operation is over now?" "With Morrison dead and his network exposed, yes," Hartley confirmed. "The conspiracy is finished. Justice can finally be served." Emily Blackwood looked up at her father with confusion and hurt in her young eyes. "Daddy, I don't understand. Are you a good man or a bad man?" Blackwood knelt beside his daughter, tears streaming down his face. "I tried to be a good man, sweetheart. But sometimes good men have to do bad things to stop worse things from happening. But you're not really bad." "No, baby, I'm not really bad. I just had to pretend to be for a very long time." As the truth settled over the ruins of Eliza's ranch, she realized that justice was more complicated than she'd ever imagined. Marcus Blackwood wasn't the monster she'd believed him to, but he was another victim of Judge Morrison's conspiracy, forced to sacrifice his honor and reputation to protect his family and serve his country. The real treasure Samuel Carter had left her wasn't gold or property, it was the truth about her family's sacrifice and the completion of a mission that had cost too many lives. Her parents hadn't died as criminals or victims, but as heroes who'd given their lives to expose a corruption that reached to the highest levels of government. The debt was finally paid, and justice would finally be served. 6 months later, spring had returned to the Montana Territory, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and the sweet scent of renewal. Eliza Mae Henderson stood on the porch of her rebuilt ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The structure was larger than the original cabin, built with the finest materials and craftsmanship that money could buy. The money had come from the federal government's seizure of Judge Morrison's criminal network assets, worth millions of dollars that were being returned to the families who'd suffered under the conspiracy. Eliza's share was substantial, but she'd chosen to use most of it to help other victims rebuild their lives. "The new deed came through yesterday," Jake said, joining her on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. They'd been married 3 weeks ago, in a ceremony attended by federal marshals, reformed criminals, and honest ranchers who'd all played a part in bringing down Morrison's empire. Eliza accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring both its warmth and the comfortable silence they shared. Marriage to Jake had been the natural conclusion to their adventure. Together they'd found in each other not just love, but a partnership built on shared purpose and mutual respect. "Any word from Marshal Hartley about the trials?" she asked. "All 23 of Morrison's associates have been convicted," Jake replied. "The last of them was sentenced yesterday life in federal prison. The conspiracy is finally finished." It had taken months to unravel the full scope of Judge Morrison's criminal network. Corrupt federal officials in 7 states had been arrested, along with dozens of local law enforcement officers and territorial politicians who'd been bought or blackmailed into cooperation. The investigation had revealed a level of government corruption that shocked even experienced federal agents. Marcus Blackwood had been the star witness in the trials, his 15 years of undercover work providing evidence that convicted criminals who'd thought themselves untouchable. In recognition of his service and sacrifice, the federal government had pardoned his apparent crimes and restored his reputation. He was now serving as a special federal prosecutor, helping to clean up the corruption his investigation had exposed. "Emily asked if she could visit next week," Jake continued. "She wants to see the horses." Eliza smiled at the thought of the little girl who'd become like a daughter to her. Emily Blackwood had struggled to understand her father's double life, but she'd adapted with the resilience of childhood. The friendship between Emily and Eliza had helped heal wounds on both sides of their family's tragic history. Catherine Banks approached from the direction of the barn, leading a magnificent chestnut mare that had been a wedding gift from her father. William Banks had been vindicated by the investigation, his years of secret documentation proving crucial to convicting Morrison's network. He'd been reinstated as a federal marshal and was now helping to rebuild the territorial banking system on honest foundations. "The papers from San Francisco arrived this morning," Catherine said, handing Eliza a thick envelope. "Everything about Faith's adoption and her real parentage." Inside the envelope were documents that told the complete story of Eliza's twin sister, a brilliant, beautiful woman who'd been denied the chance to know her real family, but had lived a life of kindness and purpose, despite the lies surrounding her origin. There were photographs, letters, and testimonials from people whose lives Faith had touched during her brief time on Earth. "She was a teacher," Eliza said, studying a photograph of Faith standing with a group of immigrant children in front of a San Francisco schoolhouse. Just like Grace Morrison, her aunt. The resemblance between the twins was unmistakable, but there were differences too. Faith had lived a life of privilege and education, while Eliza had known hardship and struggle. Yet both had inherited their mother's strength and their father's determination to help others. "There's something else," Catherine said gently. "Faith left a will. She never married, and she left everything to my unknown sister, if she can ever be found. The lawyers have been looking for you for 3 years. The inheritance was substantial enough to fund schools and hospitals across the territory, continuing Faith's work of helping children and families in need. It was a final gift from the sister Eliza had never known, a legacy of love that transcended death and distance." As the morning sun climbed higher, Eliza found herself thinking about Samuel Carter and the debt he'd died to repay. His sacrifice had set in motion events that brought justice to hundreds of victims and exposed corruption that might have continued for decades. The treasure he'd promised wasn't just gold and property, it was the restoration of truth and the triumph of justice over evil. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked, following her gaze toward the mountains where their adventure had begun. "Giving up the quiet life for all this complexity?" Eliza considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had been filled with trials, investigations, and the difficult work of rebuilding lives and communities shattered by years of corruption. There had been times when she'd longed for the simple challenges of ranch work and the peaceful solitude of her old life. "No," she said finally, "my parents didn't raise me to hide from responsibility. They died fighting for justice, and now I get to see that fight completed." Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "What's next then? We've got enough money to live comfortably for the rest of our lives, but somehow I don't see you settling for comfort. The territorial governor wants to appoint me as a special investigator," Eliza said. "There are still corrupt officials who escaped Morrison's network, still families who need help recovering what was stolen from them. Dangerous work." "Important work," she corrected. "And I won't be doing it alone." Jake's smile was warm with promise. "Partners?" "Always," Eliza replied, touching the silver medallion that now hung openly around her neck. It had become a symbol not just of her family's legacy, but of the bond between all the families who'd suffered under Morrison's conspiracy and found strength in each other. As they stood together on the porch of their new home, watching the territory wake up to another day of freedom and possibility, Eliza felt the presence of everyone who'd sacrificed to make this moment possible. Her parents, her sister, Samuel Carter, and all the other victims whose deaths had finally been avenged. The debt was paid, the treasure was found, and justice had finally been served. But more than that, the love and courage that had sustained 3 generations of her family would continue through the children she and Jake would raise, the communities they would serve, and the example they would set for others who faced impossible odds. Eliza Mae Henderson had started her adventure as a struggling rancher trying to save her family's legacy. She was ending it as a woman of wealth and influence, with the power to protect other families from the kind of tragedy that had shaped her own life. Samuel Carter's final words had proved prophetic. The treasure he'd promised had indeed made her rich, not just in gold, but in purpose, love, and the knowledge that even the humblest person could change the world when they chose to fight for what was right. The Montana Territory spread out before them like a promise, vast and beautiful and filled with possibilities for justice, healing, and hope. And Eliza Mae Henderson was ready to explore every one of them, with her family's legacy guiding her path and her husband's love lighting the way forward.